Coogs House. All right, we don't have dates, we don't have times, but the Houston Cougar men's basketball schedule opponents have all been listed. And I have to say, is it really that much more competitive than last year? Let's jump into it.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, the daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater can step by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That way you can listen to the Cougs in your newsfeed each and every day. We appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day as an everydayer. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Remember to go to the YouTube channel and subscribe. Once we get to every 250 subscribers, we're giving something away. We decided at the 1,500 mark, giving away more of these hats that you guys seem to like, all kinds of different colors and fun. They have the Locked on the side, little Cougar paw on the front. Nike Drive-It hats, very, very fun. So subscribe on the YouTube page, like and comment down below. Let us know that you're an everydayer. More on that later. If you can't think of something to say, you have nothing to say after talking about basketball all day long, tell us if you're more of a wedding band person or a wedding DJ person. All right, so today's episode, we're going to talk all about the basketball schedule because the dates are not quite all out yet, but we do have a knowledge of who Houston is playing across the board, mostly. And so in doing that, I want to talk about the schedule and if it's actually more competitive or not competitive. The first segment, we're going to talk about the non-conference part of the schedule. The second segment, we'll talk about the home games. Third segment, we'll talk about the away games. But in doing so, we need to reference the quad 1, quad 2, quad 3, because quad 1, quad 2 wins, quad 3 losses, quad 4 losses are how they divide up. I'm trying to think of how to say this best. Your games on your schedule after the results are posted. So winning a game in a quad 1 or losing a game in a quad or whatever. And then they stack those up. And that's kind of how the committee ultimately picks who gets where in the tournament. So in this non-conference part, we're going to talk some about what quad 1 and 2 and those kinds of things are as well. It's a lot to do, so let's just jump on in. All right, so in the first segment, talk about the non-conference schedule. There are at least one, but up to 5 quad 1 games in this schedule. So quad 1 is if you're playing a team at home ranked between 1 and 30 in the KenPom analytical sphere. A neutral game between teams 1 and 50 in the same KenPom sphere. An away game between 1 and 75, going on the road and playing it, right? So as it gets more difficult, home, neutral, away, the numbers get bigger. Then quad 2 is 31 to 75, 51 to 100, 76 to 135, and so on and so forth, right? So the quad 1 game that's guaranteed is they're playing at Xavier in the Big 12 Big East showdown. Xavier, they're going to tell me to say it. I'm going to say it wrong probably through playing them, will be a top 75 team, and Houston's going on the road to play them. That's going to be a quad 1 game, right? Texas A&M at the Fertitta Center is a non-conference game Houston's playing. It's going to be a fun Saturday of basketball in December, I promise. That could be a quad 1 game if Texas A&M is in the top 50 in KenPom. It's a neutral site. Texas A&M could very well be in the top 50. They're kind of trending upwards. Things are going very well at that program, right? And so that could be a quad 1 game. That definitely could be. I don't imagine it's worse than a quad 2 game because I don't imagine Texas A&M falls out of the top 100. Although technically, if it were between A&M were ranked between 51st and 100, that would be where it would be. I'd imagine A&M is closer to that 40 to 60 range. If they're over 50, if not better, then that's a quad 1 game. So that's 2 quad 1 games in there. Honestly, the rest of these scheduled games in the Houston non-conference are not quad 1 or 2 games. They're not. I say scheduled games. We'll get to that in a second. But Houston's got some more sentimental things there. Like Houston's playing Pembroke State. Well, that's also where Kelvin Sampson went, right? They're playing Rice, right? They're playing like those kinds of things are more, for the sake of playing and staying in, I don't want to say exhibition mode, but Houston ought to win those games. And frankly, they're not going to necessarily help Houston unless, they're not going to help Houston make the tournament. They could only hurt Houston from making the tournament if they didn't win them. I guess if I were to pick like a difficult one that isn't we haven't talked about yet, like the Ivy League thing, you never know who's going to be good and all that. Like Princeton of being better than people thought last year. Houston plays Penn on December 30th. It's over the break, right? Like, so it's a weird holiday time. I could see that one being challenging more so than people expect, but it's still a game that realistically Houston would only get hurt by. That said, those are the scheduled non-conference games. Houston is also going to the Charleston Classic on November 16th through the 19th. It's a 3-day tournament. And in that tournament, they're potentially going to play a handful of teams. So like teams that could be in quad 1 or 2, and then that's a neutral site. So like in a neutral site, they just had to be in the top 50 in the country to be quad 1 and top 100 in the country to be quad 1 or 2, right? So in that, you're seeing Dayton, St. John's, Wake Forest, and LSU. On a given year, like Dayton has had good years, right, as a G5 team moving up in the ranks as far as like college basketball goes. St. John's and Rick Pitino, like that could be a top 50 team as well. LSU, it was just good just 2 years ago. Like they could be back. Wake Forest has up and down basketball history as well. All of those, by the time the season rolls around, could be up in the top 50 and thus make those neutral site games quad 1 games. I'd imagine most of them will be in the top 100, which would make them all quad 1 or 2 games, right? And so those are the wins that I think Houston also, like Houston might need to win the Charleston Classic to bolster their non-conference schedule, just because outside of Xavier and A&M, they're kind of lackluster there, right? Now, that's just how that thing plays out. They could also end up playing like North Texas is at the same tournament. And in a post-McCasland world, I don't know if North Texas is going to be a quad 1 or 2 win, even though it is an neutral site. Towson, right, is also in this. I don't know if Towson will be a top 100, although if they were to upset like St. John's, maybe they would be, right? So how that Charleston Classic plays out will actually have a big impact on how Houston's non-conference gets viewed nationally. Now, you and I both know that Sampson doesn't care. Jamal Shedd doesn't care. I don't imagine LJ Cryer cares. I know Juwan Robertson. Like, they're going to beat and play competitively to dominate whoever lines up across them. They did that throughout American Athletic Conference play. They might have gotten like tired of playing with their food at some point a couple times last year, but by and large, this is a very hyper-competitive basketball team. But as far as seeding goes and all those kinds of things, I do think that they need to go on like 5-0 across those Charleston games and Xavier and Texas A&M to be a top-tier seed. Being a top-tier seed helps you get farther in the tournament because you get easier teams to play against. Easier teams to play against means you're more likely to win a championship. And if you are trying to build a championship team, folks, you need to go to eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. The same when it comes to your vehicle, every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. eBay Guaranteed Fit. You can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know if the part will fit or your money back. Just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop at eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be right back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. That's right. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. All right. So that's the non-conference slate. I said in the second segment I want to talk some about home games. And I think the home games are where this really gets to be like where we really see the difficulty in next season's schedule because it's a Big 12 schedule. And in the Houston Big 12 games, right? Houston has, 10 and then 18 Big 12 games. Okay. In those 18 Big 12 games, you're at least looking at 12 quad 1 games, right? Like that is how competitive the Big 12 is. And that's a good thing for Houston after having such a lackluster non-conference schedule to get to show themselves off in the Big 12 play. For instance, both Texas games and both Kansas games will be quad one games, right? Texas and Kansas will both be in the top 30, barring some crazy drop-off throughout the entire season, and playing them home and away will be top. They'll be both in quad one. And so that's 4 right there. You also get like home versus Kansas State. I'd imagine Kansas State is in the top 30 for most of the season, if not all. Home versus Iowa State. Iowa State has, with the exception of like the COVID year, been a very strong basketball program in the 21st century. That will also be likely a quad one game. At Oklahoma, at Baylor, at Cincinnati, at Central Florida, right? On the road, those teams just have to be in the top 75 to be quad one games. It feels like, per Ken Palm, those teams would all be in quad one. And I say that not just because I'm guessing. That's where those teams finished a year ago, and they're all going to be as good, if not better, next season, right? And talking about Cincinnati, Central Florida getting better. I guess Baylor lost Kante George, and we got LJ Cryer, but they seem to reload very well. Like, those teams will continue to get better, and those teams are all like their end of season ranking last year would make them quad one wins next season. That's without even talking about that Houston has to play West Virginia and Texas Tech at home. You could have the McCaslin we talking about left in North Texas to go to Texas Tech, and he's a great basketball coach, built up a great program at North Texas, and Texas Tech has been very good very recently. You could see how that could be a quad. If that team finished in the top 30 in Ken Palm, that could be a quad one game, right? For West Virginia, without Bob Huggins, who knows what they're going to look like. But last year they finished in the top. That would have been a top 30 team in Ken Palm. That would have been a team that Houston would be playing in a quad one game. So, like, theoretically, that could as well. And so in looking at the home games to go to, well, first of all, I'd say go to all of them, right? Big 12 basketball is as fun as it gets. It's the best basketball conference in America. And frankly, it's only getting stronger with adding Cincinnati and Central Florida and obviously us. So I'd say go to all of them. But the home and home opponents, Cincinnati's a fun rivalry, kind of building that up. Same with Central Florida. But Kansas, Texas, because obviously the rivalry game aspect is there. We had kind of all hoped on that happening in the Elite Eight last season. Miami played spoiler there. We get to actually have it this season in conference play, home and home. And frankly, we want to make sure we fill Fertitta with red shirts, not orange shirts. So let's make sure we do that, right? Kansas may very well be a top 5 team in the country when preseason polls start rolling out in September and October. So be paying attention to that, but that's when you're going to want to get to as well. And then like Texas Tech has the same kind of, even if it takes McCaslin's longer to build that up than it did at North Texas, or there's, just whatever. That is a rivalry in the making for sure, right? That is something building towards that same rivalry that we're looking for in the football program, right? Like the same kind of like 2 large public universities in the Big 12, in the state of Texas, et cetera. That's going to be a fairly competitive rivalry across all sports, I would imagine. Houston gets them at home this year, right? Kansas State, here's my hot take. Kansas State is randomly good at things all the time and kind of underrated. That's going to be a competitive basketball game too. All these games, that's going to be a very competitive basketball game. And so I look at all these and filling these up for these different opponents. Like, I guess Oklahoma State's like the only home game that's like not a great opponent. But if we just looked at last season, they would have been a quad 2 game as well for Houston to have at home, just based on where they finished last season at. And like, that's probably the worst conference opponent Houston gets at home, unless Central Florida, Cincinnati don't step up to the plate like I think they will. That's tremendous. Of the legacy Big 12 teams, it's the worst one coming to town. And that's a really good basketball team. And so suddenly, like, I guess admittedly, West Virginia could implode without Huggins or whatever. Like, Texas has choked things away before, right? These things happen. But theoretically, every single home game Houston's playing could be a quad 1 or quad 2 win, that means that you need to get to Fertitta to cheer those games on and cheer in those games and do your part in helping Houston win those games, because frankly, every single one of those wins is going to be key in getting Houston a higher seed in the end of your tournament, right? March Madness. And we talked about this before, right? Like that just means you have an easier path. An easier path doesn't mean necessarily anything's guaranteed, but it does help you in the long run. That's how Houston continues to get to the Sweet 16, right? But I say that to say that, like, that's also really the reason those wins all help you get higher seeds is because they're all difficult games. The Big 12 is incredibly challenging, and that's a difficult slate, right? No gimmies, no layups, no anything in that slate. And I think that, you're potentially playing at any point, Kansas, Texas, or Houston Cougars could all be the number one team in the country, right? Like at any point in next season, if you told me any of those teams are number one team in the country, I'd believe it, right? And so, like, that's going to be an exciting point to be Houston Cougar. You got to make sure you're there for those quad 1 and quad 2 victories. Again, winning quad 1 and quad 2 games helps elevate your status. You don't want to lose quad 3 and 4 games. I'm not saying, but you want the more quad 1 and 2 wins you got, the better. And Houston's got potentially all 9 conference home games as quad 1 or quad 2 games. That's huge. That is so big for the Houston Cougars. Now, how they fare against those? Admittedly, there's part of me that's like, well, they're good enough to go 9-0. And I say that, don't smirk. I smirked. You don't get to smirk too. I say to say that, like, in a video game where there is just, you turn off injuries, you turn off rest, whatever, and just go, I think in a vacuum, Houston is good enough to go 9-0 across that slate. I really, really do. I love the matchup with Houston and Texas because of Houston's guard play. Admittedly, Kansas adding Hunter Dickinson adds some size to them, but I also think it slows them down. And frankly, I see Jamal Shead being an incredibly frustrating presence in the Kansas backcourt. And I also don't know who they have that comes out to cover LJ Cryer. Like, I feel like Cryer. I know Cryer played very well against them last year, but I also feel like he's only going to play better when he's playing off of Jamal and Terrence and Dunn, like all those guys in Houston. So, admittedly, I think they can go 9-0 across that slate. But if I were to be more realistic, because these are going to be complex, you're going to play one on a Saturday and one on a Monday, or one on a Saturday and one on a Tuesday, and like short turnarounds, tired legs, etc. I imagine Houston goes like 6-3, 7-2. Let's say 7-2. I think Houston goes 7-2 across these home games. At worst, like, again, I think they could realistically go 9-0 across these home games, and so that's 9 Big 12 wins. That's 9 quad 1 and 2 wins. I mean, that's what more. If they're all quad 1 games, that's more than Houston had last year, right? Like that's how good this Big 12 conference is. When Houston played Alabama, Virginia, etc. last year, right? Like that's more than they got last year, right? So if those all turn out to be quad 1 games, that's really, really big time. In the third segment, we'll talk about the road games, how they fit into this. So let's just jump in. It's kind of the same kind of scoop. First of all, the home games they still have. So Cincinnati, Iowa State, Kansas, Texas, Central Florida. Those are all teams Houston has to travel to because they're playing home and home, so you can see both. They also get Baylor, TCU, Oklahoma, and BYU on the road. Things that work out well for Houston, all of these short possible road trips, UT Austin, TCU, Baylor, Oklahoma, those are all relatively short trips, right? Frankly, they're all closer than Tech. Those are all in the road game slate and in the 9 road games there, right? That's important. I think that's important because they're all potentially bus trips. Not that they're going to take a bus. I don't mean to judge or guess how Houston will travel, but like that's the kind of distance we're talking about. That means I expect to see some red t-shirts there. But B, I also think that is good for, if you have those short turnarounds, you play on Saturday, play on Monday or whatever, right? I'm excited for a couple of these because they're going to be really, really hostile. Obviously, Fog Allen is a historic place to play. Playing Kansas there is like bucket list type item. If you can get to Kansas to watch that one, I don't even necessarily care what the teams are rated. I mean, they could very well be 1 and 2 in the country, but I don't necessarily care what they're rated. That is a historic place to play. I say go. That's where you got to get to, right? Now that said, obviously that's a great game potentially because both teams could be 1 and 2 in the country or whatever, right? So that's potentially there, right? UT Austin, Texas is going to the SEC. After this, go see they have a new stadium. Go see all that fun too. Austin, keep Austin wearing all that. Go enjoy that rivalry game there. That'll also be a team that, unless Texas falls apart, which they might, that could be 2 top 10 teams very quickly, right? But those things, like, obvious. I think everyone in the country can look at this schedule and be like, oh, those can be fun ones to go to. Baylor, LJ Cryer, after being at Baylor for a couple years now, comes to Houston, slotted into the starting 2 guard. Tremendous shooter, tremendous offensive player, a lot of swag. That game's going to be fun to watch, right? That Baylor will, I'm sure, give him a welcome that we would be giving someone on the inverse, right? Like the same kind of loud chaos. Hopefully it's all good-natured and fun. Baylor, don't prove me wrong there. But I think if you're looking at like in-state rivalries brewing, is LJ Cryer the impetus of that on the basketball front? Right? Like LJ Cryer leaving Baylor to come to Houston as Houston moves into the Big 12. He's very, very good, very, very talented. Might be a pro this time next year. Is that the spark of that rivalry, just like the LJ Cryer move? It's not, I'm not saying it's Babe Ruth from the Red Sox to the Yankees, but it's something like that, right? That sparks those 2 programs having disdain for one another, or more disdain than they would have otherwise, right? Baylor's going to, again, go nuts for that. TCU, you could do the same, like, DFW Houston area thing people want to do. I would point out culturally, TCU and Fort Worth is not the same as Dallas, and those kinds of things. That's when I wish SMU was a Pac-12 school. It's a whole separate tangent, but like then if SMU were Pac-12 too, you have like Pac-12, Big 12, Dallas, Houston. That's fun. Anyway, digression. That could be a fun trip. TCU has had some like good years lately. I know Miles is gone or whatever. Like Eddie Lampkin's gone, but like that's been a fun program to like follow from a distance. Some Houston area kids typically end up on TCU. So again, like going to TCU would be a fun one to go to. The one that I'm interested to see what they do, and we may wrap here. Oklahoma, Sampson and company going back to Oklahoma will be fascinating to see how they handle it, because I think there are a lot of people in Norman that were upset when Sampson left Oklahoma to go to Indiana, right? Understandably so. He was building a Hall of Fame career resume, Hall of Fame resume / career. I don't know why I put those together, but he was building that up while he's at Oklahoma. He left to go to the blue blood that is Indiana. And I think some people there felt a little burned. He also, it's not stuff that would get him in trouble now, but the rules were different then, and some stuff went wrong while he was at Oklahoma and Indiana. And so, like, what does all that have to do with one another? We'll see how they handle all that. But also, realistically, Kelvin Sampson gave Oklahoma some of their best basketball memories of all time, right? And so I could also see, and I think what's more likely, because it's been a while at this point, a very warm welcome for Kelvin Sampson, right? A very like homecoming type welcome for Kelvin Sampson as they walk back in the doors at Oklahoma. Because again, his son Kellen played for him at Oklahoma. Assistant coach Hollis Price played for him at Oklahoma. Quantas White played for Sampson at Oklahoma. A lot of these Sampson connections on the Houston staff, he talks about like having his own guys on staff all the time and all those kind of like he has to look out for his guys and his guys as assistant coach and help his guys get hired. A lot of his guys actually have ties to that time at Oklahoma. And so like I see the Houston staff carrying Houston into Oklahoma. And I guess Oklahoma I project would be better than BYU, but of the nine road games of the legacy Big 12 teams on Houston's road slate, I imagine Oklahoma's the worst one. Right? So we'll see. But with that said, I imagine that there'll be some sort of chaos surrounding Sampson and company coming back. And I'm excited and optimistic about what that could look like, because I love things like what they did for Sampson when he won a 700th game last season, right? I love things like when they went to East Carolina for the last time last season and Sampson got to talk about like being back in the state of North Carolina. I love those kinds of moments. I like Sampson's got a wildly unique and interesting history, and getting to see him live out those things could be really, really cool and fun. And Oklahoma does play a key part in that. And so how they talk about that, and frankly, the only time they get to do this, because then Oklahoma gets up, goes to the SEC, and Houston's in the Big 12, and they may never play in Norman ever again, right? And so like those kinds of, that opportunity for Oklahoma is there, and I'm hoping they do it. I'm optimistic they do it. And if I were going to pick a road game, BYU, BYU would be fun, I guess, Utah, whatever. If it's ski season, fine. Baylor, BU is what I was thinking. Baylor, LJ Cryer noise and nonsense, potential fun. But Oklahoma could be cool. And that's when I think they should get to as well. Again, if I'm looking at the 9 road games, I think Houston actually got a favorable poll here. Again, I think they could win all 9. Now, that's in the same vacuum. Parker, you just said they go 18-0. I think in a vacuum, or you're not talking about tired legs, the mental wear and tear of an 18-game Big 12 schedule, all those kinds of things. I do think in a vacuum, Houston can win every game they play in the Big 12. I'm not going to back off of that in a vacuum. Once the dates and times and things like that come out, we might talk a little different. But in a vacuum, I think that they could win all 9 games on the road and all 9 games at home and go 18-0. Outside of that vacuum, without the dates and times in front of me, I think more realistically, you're looking at like 5-4, 6-3 on the road, right? They'll beat BYU. They ought to beat TCU. They ought to beat Central Florida. They ought to beat Cincinnati, right? Iowa State, long road, tough place to play. Kansas, tough place to play, right? Losing at Kansas is not like the worst thing in the world. They have won the Big 12 for like the last 20 years. We're going to take it from them, but like they won the Big 12 the last 20 years, right? Whatever it is, right? Baylor, again, hostile. Oklahoma could be weird, but I really do think they can win all those games. So, like, again, I'll say, and then outside that vacuum, let's go say 5-4, 6-3, somewhere in there, right? That's a very, very, very strong first year in the Big 12. But let's not forget, Houston's basketball programs in the Big 12 has been wanting to add to itself. I mean, you've heard Yormark say it. You've heard other coaches across college basketball. Like, Houston jumping in the Big 12 is like when the Power Rangers form up together. Like that's what we're talking about here, right? Like that's the kind of thing we're looking at. And so anyway, that's my prediction on the initial schedule outlet. Now, when we get dates and times, we'll break that down, because things like playing at Iowa State on Saturday and then playing at BYU on a Monday might make that BYU game more difficult than I think, right? Or whatever, right? And so I could see how those kinds of things could shift things, but we'll be following that here Locked On Cougs. So make sure you hit subscribe and download to follow each and every day. You can find me on Twitter/X or Threads or Instagram or any of your favorite social media handles or sites. My handle is always at Painsworth, it's PAINSWORTH512 on Twitter, Instagram, and all those various different things. Thank you all so much for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day, and as an everydayer that made it to the end of the show. Please give us a question or something you want to talk about in the comment section down below. Use the hashtag everydayer, and we may talk about it in the third segment of the show as a reward for people making it all the way to the end. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. Locked On Cougs is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day.